A 5-minute call on behalf of the Labor Party, Jenny Salisa.
Talofa lava. Happy Samoan Language Week. Whawhitaitele lava for this call on the Residential Tenancy Agreement Amendment Bill, Mr Speaker. This bill will introduce a few useful provisions for providing some standards for housing in the private rental market. However, it does not go far enough to address the dreadful circumstances in which many of our families are living, particularly during this time as we go into the cold winter months. Mr Speaker, introducing minimum insulation standards as proposed by this bill for private rental houses are indeed a step in the right direction, but it is a wasted opportunity because this national government should be doing more. Mr Speaker, when a freezing cold house is insulated, but there is absolutely no requirement for modern efficient heating, that rental house, it still remains a very cold, freezing rental house. It does not magically become warm and dry. During winter, Mr Speaker, when so many of our children, our families, and especially our elderly, who are prone to feeling the cold so much more than those of us who are younger, it will still leave them at risk of all kinds of respiratory illnesses. Our freezing cold houses, Mr Speaker, is something that we should address in this bill, but that unfortunately is an opportunity this government hasn't taken up. Each year, over 40,000 of our children, particularly our poor, vulnerable kids, are admitted to hospitals for all kinds of respiratory illnesses. That is also a cost that we see in a different part of society in the health bill that this current government is not considering, that we could actually prevent some of that cost should we actually put in insulation and heating in this bill. This is not acceptable, Mr Speaker. We know that the condition of many of the houses in New Zealand are not warm, dry and healthy. We also know that too many of our houses are contributing to the deaths of some of our children. Research shows that over 70% of children, especially those kids who are living in poverty, live in rented accommodation, and most of them, around 53%, live in private rental houses. I've got to say, Mr Speaker, that this percentage is even higher for Pacific and Māori, because for Pacific families, only 18% of our people own houses. 82% of Pacific families rent either from the state or from private landlords. No child should be living in a house that makes them sick. But the sad fact is that thousands of our children are admitted to hospital for respiratory illnesses, and worse, around 15 children each year die from pneumonia. Emily Taborn is an example of one of those children, a toddler from Otara in my electorate in Manukau East, who unfortunately died from a preventable death from complications of pneumonia. And according to the coroner, the condition of the house that she lived in, which was not an insulated house, which was a freezing cold, mouldy house, contributed to her death. Honourable Nick Smith, in his speech earlier on in this third reading of this bill, stated, and I quote, "Cost is important and we should be careful about imposing cost, that cost imposed is not more than any percentage gains." Well, where does one start with such a statement, Mr Speaker? The cost that is much more important to a local MP like myself are children's lives. Too many of our children die, preventable deaths, and it is something that we as members of this House could do something about, especially in bills like this one. And we should do everything as members of Parliament to ensure that we are saving as many children's lives as possible, regardless of where they live. Mr Speaker, in budget of 2013, 3 years ago, this national government committed to mitigating the negative health outcomes of poverty and poor housing. Now, the Children's Commissioner, Dr. Russell Wills, in his submission to this select committee, he stated that he was very disappointed in this bill, and in his view, this bill will not improve the health of thousands of children living in poor quality housing. So this is yet another example, Mr Speaker, of another broken promise from this government, where they committed to doing something and they haven't actually delivered on that promise. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Kia ora. Maureen Pugh.
Thank you,